Hello, so today we'll be going over exercise 7.2 here. And so the first part of 7.2 asks us to draw in arrows to complete the diagram on the left. So if we look at this diagram here, we have a domain A and a codomain B. And we are looking at a function mapping f of x equals the ceiling of x. The ceiling function is a function that takes in some value or real number x and maps it to the closest integer greater than or equal to x. So for example, if we have like ceiling of 2.3, that would equal 3 because that's the largest integer greater than or equal to 2.3. And then if we have ceiling of 2, for example, that would just map to itself because 2 is greater than or equal to 2. And so if we look at our domain here, we have -1 and -1, since it's already an integer, it'll just map to itself with the ceiling function. Then 1.6. 1.6, if we round it up with the ceiling function, it will go to 2. So 1.6 maps to 2. And then 2 will map to itself, kind of like -1. And then 2.1, it will go up and it will map to 3 here. So here is our diagram. And then we have to determine, is this function one-to-one? Well, when we look at this function, we see that this value 2 here has been mapped to by two elements of the domain, 2 and 1.6. So for one-to-one, if we have f of a equals to f of b, then a equals b. But in this case, 1.6 is not equal to 2. So we know that this function here is not one-to-one. Next, we look at, is it onto? So onto functions is every element in the codomain is mapped to by some element in the domain. But we see that 0 and 1 are not mapped to. So we know that this here is not onto either. So now let's see how we can make how we can turn this into a one-to-one or an onto function. So our next part here is, what element can you remove from the domain to make this function one-to-one? So if we remember, we had this mapping from -1 to -1, 1.6 to 2, 2 to 2, and 2.1 to 3. So what element can we remove from the domain to make it one-to-one? Well, we see that 2.1 maps to 3 and -1 maps to -1, and they're the only elements that map to each of the values in the codomain, but we see that 1.6 and 2, as mentioned before, both map to 2. So the element we would want to remove from the domain would either be 1.6 or 2. And that would make sure that only one value of the domain maps to 2. And so, which would make it one-to-one. Then we are asked, what are two elements you can add to the domain to make this function onto? So we know that the two elements we know that -1, 2, and 3 are all mapped to. So we want something that maps to 0 and 1. So we want some ceiling of A such that equals to 0, and some ceiling of B that equals 1. And the simplest case of this is if we let A equal 0 and B equal 1 because they map to themselves. So we could add two elements, 0 and 1, to A to make this function an onto function. We could also add other things. For example, you could add like 0 and 0.5, and 0.5, the ceiling of that would be 1 as well. So there's a lot of options you have to add there. But yeah, other than that, thank you for listening into this problem and have a wonderful day.